The boy stumbled out of the mesquite shadows, breath ragged, eyes wide with a fear no child should carry. "Help me, mister. They took my sister." His voice cracked, and the wind seemed to hold still around him. The cowboy saw the tracks, fresh, hurried, dragging marks in the dust, and something inside him tightened. He didn't ask who they were. He didn't ask why they'd taken her. He simply felt the weight of a choice he couldn't walk away from, and follow the trail into the rising heat. Before we ride deeper into the story, if the spirit of the old frontier still stirs your heart, the campfire tales, the courage, the dust, and the honor, then saddle up with us. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. The cowboy had ridden through the mesquite thick and expecting nothing more than another scorched mile of lonely trail when he caught the flicker of movement, too small to be a deer, too shaken to be anything but human. And before he could call out, the Comanche boy stumbled into the open, breath sawing in and out of his chest, eyes blown wide with a terror no young soul should ever have to name. And when he whispered, "Help me, mister. They took my sister," the words seemed to drag the very wind to a halt. The cowboy swung down from his horse, instincts honed by years of violence and mercy sharpening together, and crouched to study the earth where the boy had come from, seeing the story written in dust and broken branches. 3 sets of hoofprints, one rider favoring his right side judging by the uneven pressure in the sand, and smaller scuffs where someone had stumbled, been yanked up, and dragged, each mark carrying the echo of a struggle fierce enough to make the cowboy's jaw clench. He asked no questions, not yet, because the boy's trembling hands and the wild tremor in his voice already told him that speaking would do more harm than silence. So instead he placed a steadying palm on the child's shoulder and turned fully to the tracks, letting the slow burn weight of what lay ahead settle into his chest like cooling iron. The beginning of a mystery unfolding in crumbs of dirt and the ghost of violence. The boy pointed weakly toward the deeper brush, his voice cracking as he tried to say her name but failed. And the cowboy understood that answers would come later. Right now, action was the only language the frontier respected, so he followed the trail a few yards, taking in the signs that only someone familiar with the worst parts of men would recognize. The hurried hoofbeats showing haste, the slight spray of dried blood catching on sunlit pebbles revealing that one of the abductors or their captive had bled, and a long, uneven linette through the dust where a lightweight body had been dragged, fighting every step. Something tightened behind the cowboy's ribs, a familiar ache mixing guilt with resolve, memories of times he'd acted too late shadowing the present moment, and he returned to the boy, lifting him gently despite the child's initial flinch, placing him in the saddle before swinging up behind him, the horse shifting under their combined weight but steady and sure as if it sensed the urgency. The boy clutched the saddle horn, knuckles white, and the cowboy let the reins hang loose for a moment as he spoke softly, not comfort exactly, but a promise carried in tone rather than words, that he would not abandon this trail, no matter where it led, no matter who waited at its end. Then, with a slow breath that tasted of dust, sun, and the faint metallic dang of danger, he nudged the horse forward, following the sharp indentation of hoof prints leading away from safety and into a horizon that pulsed with heat and unanswered questions, each step deepening the sense that he wasn't just chasing raiders but stepping into the kind of story where innocence and brutality collided, where choices carved themselves into a man's soul. And though the boy remained silent, his quiet shudder against the cowboy's chest spoke volumes. Fear, desperation, and a hope so fragile felt like something sacred in a world too rough to hold it. The cowboy tightened his grip ever so slightly, guiding the horse onward, resolving that whatever lay ahead, gunmen, outlaws, or old ghosts, he would face it carrying the weight of his child's trust. Because from the moment the boy stepped from the shadows and begged for help, the cowboy knew this wasn't just another trail but a reckoning waiting to unfold in the rising heat. The horse moved like a metronome across the high, sun-silvered plain while the cowboy sat with the Comanche boy clutched in front of him, small shoulders shaking beneath his arm and the smell of mesquite and dust clinging to both of them. And the cowboy said almost nothing because words felt too fragile to hold the boy's terror. Instead he listened, to the faint hitch in the child's breathing, to the way his fingers gripped the saddle horn until the knuckles blanched, to the soft, repeated muttering of a name, Naya, So thin it might have been a prayer, so fierce it might have been a vow. And every time the wind pushed that name back across the cowboy's face, he felt an ache he refused to own aloud. Memory, like a shadow that follows a man who's ridden too many dusk trails, began to settle on him. Times he'd watched from behind a rock while men he'd once trusted dragged others off, faces blurring with distance and cowardice. A night when a woman's scream had threaded through pines and he had told himself the moon would keep her safe, an excuse that lodged in his throat for years, the slow accumulation of small failures that had carved hollows into his chest and taught him the grammar of regret. And now, with the boy's head against his back and the tracks ahead scattering toward a rim of heat, those old wounds flexed and demanded he not act in the same small, silent ways. The boy, when he could force the words past the dryness in his mouth, gave only fragments, shards of details like a man reconstructing a broken mirror. A white man with a long scar cutting down his cheek, a Kiowa renegade who spat when he stepped, and the sharp, cruel laugh of another who had ridden at the rear and seemed to revel in fear. Each fragment fell like a pebble into the cowboy's thoughts, making ripples of suspicion and dread. And the names and faces the boy could not fully form became ghosts the cowboy had to chase down with his eyes and his hands on the slow, certain measuring of experience. It settled on him then, heavy and crystalline. This was no simple raid for goods or a drunken fight over claim markers. This stank of something deeper, of men profiting from human suffering, of a network that traded people like pack animals. And the moral arithmetic of the moment tightened into a single, undeniable sum. He could turn back to his solitary road and left it the chance to make it right, or he could follow and risk more than his hide. The boy's small, patient trust made the calculation for him. He had a face for weighing consequences, his jaw set, not with bravado but with the thin, honest steel that comes when a man knows what kind of man he will not be. And he found himself telling the boy, quietly, that he would not leave Naya to whatever dark fate awaited her, that he would see this through, words spare, but enough to be a promise rather than a threat. As they rode, the landscape altered like chapters turning. Ankle-high sage gave way to rocky gullies, the air grew thinner and hotter, and the tracks they followed told a ragged story. 3 horses, one favoring a hind leg, a smear of dried blood on a rock, a line through the dust where a small form had been dragged while a heavier boot pattern had tried to hide the direction. But beyond the physical clues, the cowboy kept watching the boy's face, mapping courage and the calcified shock that masks itself as silence. And in those moments he understood that the boy's bravery was not the absence of fear but the superiority of hope over it. He thought of how long it had been since anyone had asked him to carry another's burden. He thought of how easy it would be to hand the boy off to some passing patrol and ride on, unnoticed, into the sunset he normally courted. But every time the idea surfaced, the boy's whispered name nudged him back, anchoring him to a decision that would define him in ways coins and saloons never could. So he let the horse pick its pace and the land reveal its secrets, and in the slow burn of the ride his reluctance softened into resolve, less a heroic flair than the quiet turning of a man who remembers what it costs to stand by and lets the past teach him to act differently this time. By late afternoon and the land softened into a creek bed, its shallow ribbon of water catching the sun in trembling shards of light. And as the cowboy guided the horse down the bank with the boy still held steady in front of him, he felt the subtle change beneath the hooves. The tracks that had been loose and dusty now pressed deeper, clearer, weighted with the frantic energy of flight and resistance. He dismounted without a word, boots sinking slightly into the damp soil as he crouched to read what the earth had recorded, the boy hovering just behind him with breath tight in his throat. Blood, thin and pink from mingling with the stream, drifted in delicate tendrils downstream like smoke dissolving into air, and the cowboy followed its faint trail back to the source, a rock with dark stains, a scrap of torn fabric tangled in a thorn bush, and the distinct impression of small footprints, naiads, pressed unevenly, each one marking not a passive step but a struggle, a twist, a sudden pivot as if she had fought with every wild instinct of a cornered child. He closed his eyes for a moment, seeing not just prints but movement, her kicking, pulling, refusing to surrender, and the image carved an ache through his chest, because innocence standing against brutality always carried a kind of sacred weight, a reminder of how unfair the frontier could be to those who had done nothing to deserve its cruelty. And yet, within that ache flickered admiration, a quiet respect for a girl he had never met but who had already proven braver than many grown men he'd known. The boy knelt beside him then, fingers trembling as he traced one of the prints, whispering her name like a fragile leaf carried by gusts of memory, and the cowboy placed a grounding hand on the child's shoulder before scanning the area again, searching for anything she might have left behind. It was then he spotted it, a small bracelet, made of bone beads and sinew, snapped in half and lying near the water's edge. He picked it up gently, turning it in his fingers as the boy gasped and reached for it, explaining in a choked voice that Naya never removed it, that it had been their mother's last gift, passed from one sibling to the other after she died. The cowboy studied the braid, noticing it was not worn down or frayed but sharply tugged apart, as though Naya had ripped it intentionally, offering a clue for anyone who cared enough to follow. That small, deliberate act spoke volumes. She wasn't just fighting. She was thinking, resisting, leaving a trail for the world to see if the world was willing to look. And the realization deepened the cowboy's sense of responsibility until it felt almost like a physical burden settling along his spine. He imagined her fear as she was dragged through this place, the way her breath must have hitched at the cold water, the sting of whatever injury caused the blood, and yet he also imagined the fierce set of her jaw, the spark of defiance that made her snap the bracelet, and those two images, fear and courage and wrath, wove themselves into a quiet storm inside him, a current pulling him forward with even more determination. He stood slowly, scanning farther up the creek where the tracks diverged briefly before converging again. The horse hoof prints muddied but visible, one still uneven as the injured rider pushed onward despite discomfort. He noted how the drag marks became lighter here, as though Naya had regained her footing for moments at a time, proof of her resilience. The boy clung to the broken bracelet now, chest rising and falling in shallow waves, and the cowboy told him, voice steady with a conviction he hadn't yet spoken aloud, that she was alive, that she was fighting, and that they would follow every clue she left until they reached her, no matter how long the trail dragged them or what kind of men waited at its end. Then, with the fading light stretching their shadows across the creek bed, he lifted the boy back onto the horse and followed the tracks forward, the weight of Naya's courage and the brutality of the landscape merging into a single vow that he would not, could not, let her bravery go unanswered. Dusk had settled into a bruised lavender when the cowboy and the boy crested a low ridge and saw the deserted trading post squatting in the hollow beneath them, its sagging rooflines and half-shattered walls catching the last light like a wounded animal pretending it wasn't dying. Yet even from this distance the cowboy could sense something breathing there, heat still lingering, dust unsettled, a faint smell of horse sweat drifting on the wind, and as they rode closer, hooves muffled by the thinning grass, the boy leaned forward with a small, involuntary shiver, as if he could already feel the ghost of his sister's presence clinging to the air. The cowboy swung down first, motioning for the boy to stay in the saddle while he scanned the perimeter, noting the scattered tracks pressed into the dirt, fresh hoof prints, boot marks with sharp tread edges, and the distinctive signs of a hasty regroup. Horses tied briefly, then urged onward. The trading post itself seemed to be holding its breath, and when he pushed the creaking door open, the stale scent of abandoned goods mixed with the metallic clang of recently fired weapons hit him, confirming what instinct had already whispered. The raiders had stopped here, maybe minutes or an hour ahead, long enough to take stock, to rest, to argue or plot or divide responsibilities while their captive lay somewhere unseen. The cowboy's eyes adjusted quickly in the gloom inside, and the first thing he noticed were the spent shells scattered near a cracked window, brass casings glinting faintly like discarded truths. He crouched, picking one up, rolling it between his fingers, feeling the warmth still clinging to the metal, and his jaw tightened because warm shells meant the raiders had fired recently, maybe at a pursuer, maybe at Naya, maybe at someone who had stood in their way. The boy slid off the horse and entered silently, clutching the half-broken bracelet to his chest, and when the cowboy held out the shell for him to see, the boy's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment before he whispered that the raiders must have quarreled, that one of them shouted words he couldn't understand just before they rode off again, and the cowboy nodded, filing the detail away as he continued his search. Near the back wall, half buried beneath a pile of discarded sacks, he found a torn strip of blue fabric edged with gold thread, and when he pulled it free and shook the dust from it, the boy's gasp shattered the silence like a struck match. The child reached out with trembling hands, touching the cloth reverently and fearfully all at once, whispering that it belonged to a cavalry soldier, a trader who sometimes visited their village, brought sugar and salt, always smiling, always trusted. Betrayal, sharp as a blade, slipped beneath the ribs, cut through the air between them, and the cowboy felt it deeper than he expected, because the jacket fragment meant one of two things. Either the soldier had been a victim of the raid, stripped of his clothing and possibly his life, or he had been part of it, a uniformed man moonlighting as a captor, blurring the line between outlaw and lawman until the distinction collapsed entirely. The cowboy stared at the fabric for a long moment, wrestling with memories of soldiers he'd known, some honorable, some drunk on authority, some willing to sell anything for gold, and he felt a cold, unwelcome suspicion coil in his gut. If the raiders included a cavalryman, then someone with power might be shielding them. Or worse, the very institution meant to deliver justice might be feeding the injustice itself. His thoughts darkened, thickened, drifting to questions he didn't want to ask but couldn't avoid. Were they chasing common criminals? Or were they chasing men protected by a badge, a fort, a government too distant to see the human cost of its own failures? And for the first time he wondered whether bringing Naya back would require more than grit and aim. It might demand a willingness to stand against something larger, more protected, more morally rotten than a simple gang. The boy tugged at his sleeve then, eyes huge, Booth shaking as he said that the soldier had spoken kindly to them, had shared stories, had laughed with the village children. So why would he help take Naya? The cowboy had no answer, only the steady thrum of dread building behind his ribs. But he placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, grounding them both in the single truth that mattered. Whoever waited on the trail ahead, outlaws, soldiers, or both, they would find them. And then, with night closing in and the trading post settling back into stillness, he guided the boy toward the horse, the torn cavalry cloth tucked into his coat like a warning the darkness had pressed into his hands. The cowboy had just finished scanning the trading post's rear doorway for any final sign of direction when a brittle rustling in the brush behind the building made his hand fall instinctively to his revolver. But before he could draw, a gaunt figure lurched into view, arms raised in shaky surrender, his breath coming in ragged wheezes as though Asian hail scraped his ribs raw. The man was a trapper by the look of him, clothes patched with mismatched hides, beard overgrown, eyes sharp but hollow, and he staggered forward with the dazed limp of someone who had been beaten more for sport than necessity. The cowboy stepped between the stranger and the boy, offering no greeting, only a silent readiness that told the trapper he'd get no second chance at deception. And after a trembling swallow the man began to speak, voice coarse and catching. He'd been camped along the arroyo when the raiders descended on him, taking his food, his tools, even the small bundle of pelts he had worked months to earn. They had laughed while hitting him, he said, not because they needed anything he had, but because cruelty seemed to be the marrow of their humor. The boy listened with widening eyes, his breath thinning as the trapper continued and described their leader, a white man with a scar running from the corner of his eye to the edge of his jaw. Not the kind earned in honest conflict, but the kind that came from a lifetime of surviving other people's pain. A man who spoke little but whose silence promised worse than threats. A man known among shadowed trails for selling captives to buyers who wanted labor, entertainment, or leverage. At this, the boy's fragile composure shattered, his shoulders tightening as he crumpled inward. The broken bracelet clutched to his chest like a failing heartbeat, and he let out a sound that was not a cry, not a word, but something raw and small enough to break the cowboy's breath in half. The cowboy didn't try to hush him or offer empty phrases. He simply placed a steady hand on the boy's back and let the child lean into the quiet strength of a man who understood grief too well to disrespect it with noise. The trapper's voice thinned as he continued, lowering himself onto a crate as though his bones could no longer bear the memory of what had happened, and he warned that the gang had taken a route known to few, a dry box canyon hidden several miles west, a place used by smugglers, slavers, and men who needed the earth itself to hide their sins. He explained how the canyon's entrance was narrow enough to miss unless one knew the exact line of sight, and that inside it sprawled a maze of ledges and shallow caves where captives were kept until they were sold, traded, or discarded. The cowboy felt a grim stillness settle over him as he listened, a cold certainty rooting itself in his chest, the kind that told him the window for saving Naya was shrinking. that every moment spent standing still was a moment giving the scarred man more ground, more time, more power to shape her fate. He asked the trapper a few simple questions: how many riders, how fast they moved, whether Naya was conscious or injured. But the man could offer only partial memories, blurred by terror and blows to the head. Still, the information was enough to draw a shape in the cowboy's mind: a cruel leader, 2 or 3 hardened men, a hidden canyon, a girl fighting with every heartbeat she had left. When the trapper finally fell silent, stirring into the dirt with the hollow disbelief of someone who had survived at the cost of pride, the cowboy thanked him not with words but with a nod, a small gesture, but one that acknowledged suffering and truth. Then he guided the boy back toward the horse, lifting him gently into the saddle, the child still shaking but breathing a little steadier beneath the cowboy's hand. The trapper called after them with a final warning to be careful, that the scarred man liked to leave traps behind him, as if the world wasn't already full of enough dangers. And as the cowboy mounted up and directed the horse westward toward the unseen canyon, he felt the weight of the boy's grief and the trapper's warnings braid themselves into something sharp, decisive, and unshakable. They were close now, not close enough to see Naya, but close enough to feel the gravity of what waited in the narrowing dark ahead. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like, and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then, let's get back on the trail. They made camp under an indifferent sky freckled with cold stars, the cowboy setting a small, controlled fire while the boy sat close to its edge as if the heat could stitch his nerves back together. And for a long while neither spoke. The night itself seemed to hold its breath, listening to the soft crackle as if the world were leaning in to judge the smallness of their hope. The boy's hands trembled as he warmed them. The broken bracelet waited in his palm like a relic that both comforted and cursed him. And finally, in that kind of low voice that sounds more like telling a secret than asking for permission, he began to speak of his sister, Naya, not as a frightened child but as a presence so vivid the cowboy could picture her without having seen her. Brave as a dog that won't back down from a storm, outspoken enough to call a man liar to his face, laughing with a wild, reckless music that once made the whole village turn toward her. She'd scold the boys who hurt one another and steal an apple from an unseen orchard because to her the rules were suggestions and honor was something you carried, not something you were given. The cowboy found himself listening not through the blunt filter of pity but with a stranger tenderness, the kind that rearranges a man's sense of who deserves protection. He began to see Naya not as a captain defined by what had been done to her but as a fighter whose spirit could not be easily broken, and that image made the thought of rescuing her feel less like duty and more like a chance to return a piece of light to the world. Around them the night crowded with uncertain sounds, distant hoofbeats that might be nothing or might be the ragged echo of the raiders checking a perimeter, coyotes calling like small, clever ghosts, a far-off owl that seemed to approve or disapprove with the same indifferent intonation, and the shadows moved in and out of the firelight as if marking time with their own patient hunger. The cowboy watched the boy's face in the flicker, cataloging how grief had hollowed his cheeks and made his eyes huge with a vigilance that belonged more to survivors than to children. He fought the rising panic in his own chest, those old, familiar fantasies of arriving too late, finding only echoes and the last, cruel footprints of men who'd already done their worst, and forced himself to be still, because the frontier demanded clear thought when fear wanted only motion. He thought of the trapper's story and the torn cavalry cloth and the scarred leader, of the box canyon like a throat in the land where light went to die, and the picture formed a sharpened worry at the base of his skull. Time was a slope and they were already sliding. Still, he kept his voice low and steady, not to mask fear but to give the boy something stable to hold on to. He told small, spare stories of work and weather and roads that bent the same way twice, not to distract but to anchor. The boy responded with small questions about the world. Could a man with a scar be changed? Did horses remember kindness? And each question was a fragile bridge back toward ordinary things. And as the cowboy answered, he felt the fierce, molten clarity of purpose rearrange his insides into the shape of resolve. When the wind lifted, carrying the scent of distant sage and the metallic whisper of old gunpowder, the cowboy tightened the flaps of their small blanket around the boy and kept watch, not letting his eyes close though exhaustion clotted his lids. He listened for any sound that might mean they were being followed, and when nothing came, he allowed himself one small, private vow. He would not hand this child back to a world that traded flesh for coin. Sleep finally edged toward them like an uninvited guest, thin and watchful, and as the boy's breathing evened into the small, fragile rhythm of someone who believes a promise for the first time, the cowboy sat with his back to a scrubby mesquite, the fire's heat warming his hand, and let the night fold around them. Outside their circle of light, the plains remained indifferent, full of shadows and stories, but inside it two people, one scarred by choices and the other by loss, shared a fragile truth. Courage often begins with refusing to look away, and in that refusal lay the slender, stubborn hope that by morning they would have a better map for finding Naya. Dawn rose without warmth, a pale wash of color that seemed too thin to carry heat, and as the cowboy and the boy rode toward the mouth of the canyon the trapper had warned them about, the air shifted in a way that made the cowboy's skin tighten beneath his coat, not with cold, but with that instinctive awareness that something in the land was wrong. Wind that should have danced along the rocks lay dead. Silence that should have been broken by birds or distant hoofbeats hung like a held breath, and even the horse's ears flicked uneasily as though it too sensed they were stepping into a place where sound went to die. The canyon rose ahead of them in jagged, uneven walls of sandstone, its narrow entrance half hidden by a bend in the terrain, and as they approached, the cowboy dismounted and motioned for the boy to stay close but keep behind him while he scouted ahead, each step deliberate on the dust that seemed to resist even the idea of footprints. Inside the canyon's shadowed throat, the remnants of human presence lingered, abandoned fire pits with embers too freshly scattered to be more than a few hours cold, hoofprints pressed deep and then abruptly angled away, and near a sheltered rock shelf lay a length of rope stained dark at one end, stiff with dried blood or sweat or both. The cowboy's jaw tightened as he crouched to examine it, imagining Naya's wrists bound with that same rope, imagining her being dragged or lifted or forced forward while the men argued over what to do next. The boy came forward silently, clutching the bracelet piece to his chest, eyes drawn irresistibly to the rope as though seeing it confirmed all the nightmares he'd been trying not to name, and the cowboy gently steered him away, trying to spare him the sharp ridges of what the land revealed. As he moved deeper into the canyon, the cowboy expected to find a clear direction, a single set of tracks leading out, the scuffed dust of hurried departure, but instead the earth told a story of confusion and conflict, boot prints overlapping at odd angles, crushed sage where someone had stood and hesitated, the unmistakable signs of a group dividing rather than pushing forward as one. Three distinct paths emerged like diverging fates, one climbing up a narrow ridge with loose rock that could easily give way under a rider's weight, another following the canyon floor where shadows pooled thick and still, and a third veering toward a cluster of boulders that created natural pockets perfect for hiding captives or ambushing pursuers. The realization struck the cowboy like a cold nail pressed against his spine. The raiders had split up intentionally, not out of panic but strategy, forcing anyone following them to gamble on which direction carried the girl and which carried danger meant to slow or destroy the pursuers. His mind raced, mapping the possibilities. The scarred leader, cunning and patient, would not choose the obvious route. The Kiowa renegade might prefer higher ground for scouting. The third man, the one who laughed, would choose whatever path offered the cruelty of a trap. The boy watched him, trying to read answers in his face, and the cowboy felt the weight of the moment settle heavier than any burden he'd carried in years. Three paths, one girl, one chance not to fail her. The canyon's stillness pressed in on them, amplifying every heartbeat, and the cowboy forced himself to breathe slow, to sift through the clues left by men who believed their violence made them invincible. A faint drag mark, half erased but still visible to eyes trained by years on the trail, caught his attention near the middle path, the canyon floor, its direction subtle but undeniable, and though it was not proof, it was enough to stir the whisper of instinct he had learned never to ignore. He returned to the boy, resting a steadying hand on his shoulder, and told him in a quiet, measured tone that they would choose the path through the canyon floor, because there were signs, small but true, of struggle, of someone being forced forward, and Naya was a fighter who would leave traces wherever she could. The boy nodded, trusting him with a desperation that felt like a vow in itself. And as they prepared to enter the deeper shadows of the canyon, the cowboy felt the stakes sharpen into something absolute. In these 3 paths lay 3 futures, and only one led to the girl still breathing. The canyon floor narrowed into a cruel, jagged throat as the cowboy guided the boy and the horse toward the least obvious path, the rough one, the one no sane rider would take unless they wanted to disappear into the land's broken teeth. And though the boy glanced nervously at the smoother ridge above them and the wider shadowed path to their right, he said nothing, trusting the cowboy with a kind of quiet desperation that felt more fragile than any plea. The cowboy had chosen this trail not because it looked promising but because it looked punishing, a place where boots would slip, where jagged stones bit through thin soles, where dragging a captive would leave faint signs no outlaw bothered to erase because they assumed no one would follow such misery willingly. The air grew tighter as they advanced, the walls closing like ribs around them, and the cowboy kept one hand on the reins and the other lightly touching the rock when needed, reading the land the way some men read scripture. It didn't take long for the first sign to appear, a small, deliberate carving etched into the pale bark of a twisted juniper clinging to the canyon's inner spine. The mark was 3 lines crossing a 4th, not random, not natural, but intentional in the way only a clever child trying to leave a whisper of direction might create. The boy saw it and inhaled sharply, his voice cracking as he insisted Naya carved shapes like that when she played tracking games with him. And though fear shimmered behind his words, hope pushed through like stubborn grass in dry soil. The cowboy studied the mark, feeling a slow current of certainty steady his pulse, then continued carefully, scanning both the ground and the canyon walls with the hunter's patience. The terrain worsened the farther they traveled, rocks sharp enough to bruise hooves, dry brush snagging at their legs, the earth sloping unevenly. But the challenges only made the cowboys more certain they were on the right path, because cruelty rarely cared for efficiency and men who traded human lives often used obstacles to discourage pursuit. Near a cluster of boulders wedged together like giants who died in mid-argument, the boy spotted something fluttering faintly in the breeze, high, too high for an accident, too purposeful to be trash. The cowboy lifted him onto his shoulders, then the boy extended trembling fingers to retrieve a piece of faded cloth tied around a sun-baked branch. It was faintly patterned, unmistakably part of the same garment Naya had been wearing when taken, and the knot securing it told the cowboy everything about her state of mind. She had tied it to be seen by someone who cared enough to look upward, to search beyond the obvious. The boy pressed the cloth to his face and inhaled, tears slipping quietly down his cheeks. But there was something stronger in him now than grief, resolve, sharpened by the knowledge that his sister had not collapsed into despair but fought with every ounce of cunning she had. The cowboy felt that courage like a stone settling in his chest, solid and insistent, anchoring his purpose even deeper. As they moved on, the canyon widened slightly, giving them space to breathe but offering no comfort. The wind whispered through rock crevices like distant voices arguing, and the cowboy paused often to check faint scuffs in the dirt, light indications of someone being pulled sideways, heel marks half smudged by a hurried boot, the subtle scrape of rope drawn across stone. The boy never questioned the cowboy's choices, even when the path seemed impossible, even when shadows bent strangely and the horse hesitated at tight passages. Trust hung between them like a thin but unbreakable thread, strengthened each time they found another sign of nigh useful to survive. Eventually the trail bent sharply west, revealing a narrow funnel where sunlight barely reached, and the cowboy's instincts surged. This was the kind of place men with dark intentions used to regroup or hide captives before moving them toward even worse fates. He slowed the horse, feeling the weight of the moment settle over them like cold dust, and the boy leaned forward slightly, whispering her name not in fear but in fierce relief. "Naya, Naya, we're coming," which wrapped around the cowboy's resolve like a promise he now carried as much for her as for the trembling child depending on him to read the land correctly. And as they pressed deeper into the harshest route, every sign, every mark, every scrap of cloth sharpened a single truth. Choosing the harder trail was not just instinct. It was the only path a fighter like Naya would leave behind. The canyon walls tightened once more before spitting them into a wider basin where the light spilled in crooked angles, creating a patchwork of brightness and shadow that made every rock look like it was breathing. And the cowboy sensed rather than saw the presence of another human before the boy did. The horse snorted, ears flicking sharply, and the cowboy lifted a hand for silence just as a ragged cough echoed from behind a tumble of shale near the basin's edge. What stepped, or rather crawled, into view was a man in such battered condition he barely resembled anything dangerous. Yet the cowboy didn't loosen his grip on the revolver because wounded animals were still animals with teeth. The raider, a lean rider with sunken cheeks and a hastily bandaged arm soaked through with old blood, squinted at them with the sluggish alertness of someone caught between fever and fear. His left leg dragged uselessly, and he muttered curses under his breath as though the world itself had wronged him. The cowboy stepped forward slowly, gun drawn but not aimed for the kill, and told the boy to stay behind the horse. The boy obeyed silently, though his eyes were wide and fixed on the stranger with a mixture of terror and hatred that looked far too heavy for someone so young. The raider's hand twitched toward his belt, and in an instant the cowboy's revolver was leveled in his chest, calm, unshaken, a warning that trembled with deadly certainty. After a tense breath, the raider raised both hands weakly, muttering that he didn't have the strength to fight anyway. The cowboy disarmed him with swift efficiency, kicking the man's pistol out of reach and yanking a hidden knife from his boot before crouching just far enough that their eyes met, demanding answers with a stare that had bent stronger men. The raider laughed then, a thin, broken sound that cracked like dry timber, and said the others had left him behind after a quarrel, that they claimed he was too slow, too weak, more weight than use. Between bouts of coughing, he revealed pieces of the chaos that had erupted within the gang. Naya had bitten one of them, a deep, vicious bite that drew enough blood to make the man stagger and curse that she was wild. Another had argued that keeping her was bad luck, that the scarred leader was pushing them toward danger. Tempers flared, threats were made, and in the end the leader decided to keep moving with only his two most loyal men, leaving this wounded raider to die or fend for himself. The boy stiffened at the mention of Naya's defiance, and for a moment something like pride flickered through his fear. But the cowboy was already pressing for more. Where were they headed? How far ahead? Was she hurt? The raider smirked through cracked lips and said the leader planned to take her across the border to sell her, that girls her age fetched a high price among certain buyers, men who didn't ask questions and didn't care for names. Hearing this, the boy's breath hitched sharply, a wounded inhale that cut the cowboy deeper than any knife, and the cowboy forced himself not to show his own reaction, though rage coiled around his spine like heated wire. When he demanded specifics, routes, timing, the weaknesses, the raider shook his head, claiming he knew nothing else, that he was no fool to guide a man who might return for vengeance. The cowboy, seeing the man's stubbornness hardening into uselessness, stood slowly, holstering his revolver but keeping his eyes cold enough to deliver the promise of consequences should the raider try anything foolish. But the man only sagged back against the rock, defeated, muttering that the canyon had narrowed again and that the scarred leader always took the path that let him see anyone approaching before they saw him. It wasn't much, but it was enough to stir fresh urgency in the cowboy's chest. Naya was still alive, still fighting, but the window was tightening around her like a noose, and every wasted second made the prospect of saving her dimmer. He took the boy's hand, guiding him back toward the horse, and though the boy looked back once as if memorizing the face of the men who had abandoned his humanity long before he'd abandoned his gang, the cowboy didn't waste another breath on the wounded raider. There was no time for pity when a child's life hung in the balance. And as they rode on, the cowboy felt the grim urgency settle deeper into his bones, sharpening his resolve into a single, unbreakable point aimed straight at the men who believed they could outrun justice in the shadows of the canyon. The sky darkened like a hand drawing a curtain across the sun, and before the cowboy could find a sheltering rock, the first heavy drops began to drum against the canyon's ledges, each one a sharp punctuation that set the world to a harsher rhythm. Wind rose in a howl that seemed to press the horse's flanks against the rider, and the boy hunched closer, chin tucked to his chest as if the motion could make the noise softer. Rain turned the dust to slick mud and sent ribbons of it running in small, urgent rivers through the canyon floor, blurring tracks and erasing the fine details the cowboy had relied on. Thunder rolled across the plains like a giant's rolling laugh, or maybe a warning, and in that deep, vibrating sound the cowboy felt the echo of his own pulse, the urgent drum of fear and resolve that had been growing since the boy first stumbled from the mesquite. The storm seemed to mirror their inside world, Lightning flashed sharp enough to show the inside of a man. Old regrets, quickened with the fresh terror of a child, while the wind tried to peel their promises from them like loose bark. He kept moving because stopping would mean losing ground the raiders might use to conceal whatever plans they'd set in motion for Naya, and because motion steadied the boy, who clung to the saddle horn with knuckles that went wide in the Washoe brain. As they pushed through the sheets of water, the cowboy's mind rolled back through the miles behind them, through the creek where blood had marred the water, the trading post with its warm, spent casings, the torn cavalry cloth that tasted like betrayal in his mouth, the trapper's wild warnings about the box canyon, the rope stained dark. Each memory hit him now like a memory of an old wound reopened, and he thought of how the frontier had a way of teaching cruelty as if it were a lesson worth passing down. He thought about the boy's small, steady courage, about how Naya must have fought and how the boy had carried the scent of her in his memory like a lit candle, delicate but defiantly burnished against the wind. The cowboy found himself measuring the loss of innocence not as some abstract sorrow but as a ledger with entries that named faces, children who had learned to whisper their names and stopped singing, mothers who kept their hands busy to avoid looking at empty doorways, men who wore silence like armor because it was easier than feeling. The thunder rolled again, a nearer, more threatening drum, and the cowboy clenched his jaw against that ledger, forcing himself to be present for the boy who rode before him, to be the steady place the child could return to when the world threatened to turn to chaos. The boy spoke little, only a single question once, barely audible through the storm. Will we find her? The cowboy answered not with promises he could not keep, but with a vow shaped by all the little mercies he had left, that he would follow the trail until it could no longer be followed, and even then he would not turn from the search. Their pace carried them through the rain until the canyon opened slowly, reluctantly, onto a windswept plain where the storm's teeth still chattered but the world felt broader, the space allowing them a breath that was almost hope. That was when a small, stubborn pinprick of light appeared far in the distance, amber and low and steady, the kind of firelight men made to keep wolves and bad thoughts at bay. And for a moment the cowboy's throat closed, because the sign held two meanings at once: sanctuary for the weary, or the telltale glow of an outlaw camp where prisoners were kept warm enough to survive but not free enough to leave. He shaded his eyes with a rain-slick hand then squinted, watching the light hold fast against the wind, and the boy leaned forward, articulating the one thing that had been his compass since the beginning. Naya, like a chord the cowboy could not refuse. The storm still roared, the thunder still rolled like a judge impatient with delay, but the camplight was a thin, stubborn promise on the horizon, and the cowboy felt the shape of what he must do settle into him with a clarity the storm could not drown. They would ride to that light. They would find what the darkness tried to hide, and whatever the cost, they would not ride away until Naya was back where courage belonged, among the living and the free. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like, and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. Alright then, let's get back on the trail. The storm had broken into a low, grumbling distance by the time the cowboy and the boy neared the faint firelight, its glow wavering against the ragged dark like a heartbeat newly exposed, and the cowboy signaled for silence as he slid from the horse, leading the boy into a crouch behind a jutting slab of sandstone. From there, belly to the earth, they crawled through wet sage and scraggly brush, moving slow enough that even the ground seemed to hold its breath for them. Each inch closer revealed more shapes in the flicker. 3 men hunched around the fire, their faces roughened by whiskey, exhaustion, and the smug indifference of men who believed they had bought themselves safety. And just beyond them, near a battered wagon whose wheels were sunk slightly into fresh mud, lay Naya. She was tied to one of the wagon ribs, her wrists bound high enough to force her shoulders forward, her cheeks swollen and scraped, yet even in the dim firelight the cowboy saw the stubborn lift of her chin, the watchfulness of someone who hadn't surrendered to despair. The sight struck him so sharply he felt his breath go thin, because she wasn't simply alive, she was enduring. The boy beside him trembled so hard the cowboy worried the earth itself might feel it, yet when their eyes met, the boy's whisper came firm. He wanted to help, needed to help, as though something vital in him would break if he stayed hidden while his sister breathed in pain only yards away. The cowboy studied the camp like a man mapping the interior of a storm. 3 men, one with a rifle leaning upright against a log, another with a knife strapped to his boot, the third, the one with the scar carved cruelly across his cheek, seated slightly apart, his revolver half drawn as though he trusted only himself. The fire crackled loudly enough to hide soft noises, but the wind, now shifting from the southwest, threatened to carry the smell of sweater movement toward the men, adding another layer of risk. He counted angles, the cover of a rock to their left, the shifting shadows behind the wagon, the way the fire cast long silhouettes that could deceive an inattentive eye. He knew he could take down two before the third reacted if all variables stayed in place, but nothing about the situation promised mercy for mistakes. The boy's fingers tightened on his sleeve, small but insistent, and that pressure delivered a moral weight the cowboy hadn't expected to feel so heavily in this moment. Protect the boy by keeping him hidden, or honor his courage by letting him be part of saving the sister he had crossed an entire nightmare to reach. The cowboy imagined what would happen if a bullet went astray, if fear or adrenaline pushed the boy to reveal himself too soon, if one of the raiders used the child as leverage, if Naya witnessed her brother fall while bound and helpless, and the thought almost cleaved him in two. Yet he also imagined the other truth, that telling the boy to hide while the cowboy went alone might shatter some essential part of him, diminish the fire that had kept him moving, teach him that bravery was something adults hoarded rather than something shared. The girl's subtle movement, lifting her head, straining to catch sight of the voices she imagined she heard, tilted the cowboy's heart into a deeper ache, and he placed a steady palm on the boy's shoulder, silently asking himself whether trust could exist between them if he denied the boy's plea. The wind shifted again, brushing the firelight sideways and carrying the faintest scent of damp earth toward the raiders. The cowboy knew he didn't have long to decide. He leaned close, speaking in a whisper softer than dust. If the boy helped, he must follow every instruction without hesitation, must stay low, must only move when the cowboy moved. The boy nodded fiercely, resolve sharpening his fear into something smaller and more controlled. And in that small, irreversible agreement, the cowboy felt both dread and pride settle into him like twin weights, one reminding him of everything he stood to lose, the other reminding him why he would risk it anyway. Together, they inched forward, the fire's glow flickering across Naya's bruised face as if urging them on. And the cowboy thought, with a clarity that felt like the tightening of fate itself, that the night had finally drawn them to the thin edge between ruin and redemption. The cowboy steadied his breath as the fire crackled its uneven rhythm, shadows jerking across the camp like restless spirits, and with the boy crouched beside him waiting for the signal, he lifted a smooth stone from the ground and weighed it in his hand, judging its heft before flicking it with a sharp, practiced motion toward a cluster of brush opposite their position. The rock struck with a crisp snap, loud enough to draw attention but not loud enough to betray direction, and two of the raiders jerked their heads toward the sound, one rising halfway, hand drifting toward his knife, while the scarred leader narrowed his eyes and leaned forward, posture sharpening with suspicion. The cowboy didn't wait for the moment to sour. He surged from the shadows with a silent speed that belied the long miles and sleepless nights behind him, boots barely whispering against the dirt as he closed the distance between himself and the nearest traitor, smashing the butt of his rifle into the man's jaw with a sickening crack that sent him collapsing sideways before his hands could even rise. The second raider fumbled for his revolver, shouting something guttural, but the cowboy was already on him, tackling him into the firelight and knocking the weapon free before driving an elbow into his throat, cutting the crosshord in a choking gasp. Chaos ignited instantly, fire spitting sparks, the wounded man wheezing, the third man rising with a cold, deadly calm, and in that instant the cowboy shouted the single word the boy had been waiting for, now. The boy darted from hiding, legs quivering but determination carved hard into his face, sprinting toward the wagon where Naya hung bound. She gasped at the sight of him, pain and disbelief crackling in her eyes, but she didn't speak. She simply twisted her wrists to give him better access, trusting him completely as he sawed frantically at the rope with the small knife the cowboy had pressed into his palm earlier. Meanwhile, the scarred leader lunged at the cowboy with a fury that felt almost ceremonial, as if cruelty were the blade he had spent years sharpening, and the two men crashed to the ground in a violent tangle of limbs and grit, fists slamming into bone, boots scraping for leverage. The scarred man was stronger, heavier, the cords of his arms thickened by a life built on domination, and he drove the cowboy's head into the dirt hard enough to flash white pain across his vision. The cowboy tasted blood, felt the world tilt. But through the ringing in his skull he saw the boy's trembling fingers working at the rope, saw Naya grimace with every movement, saw the scarred man's hand reaching for the revolver pin beneath them. And something old and buried inside him flared awake, a refusal born of every failure he'd carried, every scream he'd heard too late, every ghost that had followed him across empty plains. With a guttural breath he twisted his body sideways, wrenching the revolver out of the scarred man's reach, then drove his knee upward with brutal precision into the man's ribs. The leader roared, swinging wildly, but the cowboy used the moment to heave them both toward the fire, where sparks burst upward in a frantic bloom and heat seared the air between them. They grappled like two beasts torn from the same hell, the scarred man's strength shoving the cowboy back toward the flames, the cowboy clawing for any advantage, until his hand found the heavy oak log at the fire's edge. With a surge fueled not by strength but by a resolve sharpened into something near holy, he swung the log into the scarred man's shoulder, the blow sending the outlaw sprawling with a snarl of rage. At that exact breath, Naya's rope snapped free under the boy's blade, and she collapsed forward into her brother's arms, sobbing once but pushing herself upright, whispering she could run. The cowboy dragged himself to his feet, lungs burning, and advanced on the scarred man who staggered, reaching for a fallen weapon, but the cowboy was already there, knocking it away and slamming him to the ground with a force that ended the fight, pinning him under a knee planted like judgment itself. And as the fire hissed and the last echoes of violence trembled into silence, the cowboy realized the night had turned in their favor, not by luck, not by strength alone, but by the stubborn, unstoppable will of three people who refused to surrender to darkness. The scarred man kicked and spat as the cowboy planted his knee into the outlaw's chest, the dirt under them a cold, indifferent witness to a violence that felt both necessary and abhorrent. And for a long breath the world narrowed to the ragged sound of the leader's coughing and the boy's muffled sobs as he held Naya close. The cowboy's hands trembled with fatigue and adrenaline as he wrenched the scarred man's arm behind his back, feeling the coarse leather of a cuff and the stubborn set of a man who had built his life on taking rather than giving. And when the outlaw laughed, it was a sound without humor, a dry rasp that tried to claim courage it did not possess. The man's face was a map of cruelty, old scars intersecting like crooked roads, and he fixed the cowboy with a sneer, the kind of look designed to buy a moment of leverage by trading in contempt. And from somewhere within that sneer he produced a dirty, crumpled roll of bills, the paper worn soft by greedy fingers, and tossed them toward the cowboy as if money could buy absolution, as if coin could close the gap between the ruin he'd caused and a clean conscience. "Take it," he spat, voice oil slick and contemptuous. "You want to be a judge? Take it and walk away. Nobody'll miss me and there's no law that'll touch me in time." The offer hung in the smoky air like an insult against the night, and for a heartbeat the cowboy felt the old hunger for easy endings, the temptation to let violence be wiped away with coin, to accept compensation and move on as if justice were a commodity. But then his eyes flicked to the boy and Naya, to the way they clung to one another with hands trembling yet fierce, holding each other as if their small bodies could anchor the world. The sight steeled something in him that had been softened by years of wandering, the knowledge that certain debts could not be monetized, that the currency of courage and survival was not for sale. He pushed the money away with a negating sweep of his hand and tightened the ropes he had torn from the wagon, binding the scarred man's wrists with practice knots that left no room for escape. Because binding a man like that was not merely physical restraint but a declaration, a refusal to let revenge replace law, a demand that the wrongdoer be made to face what he had done before any final judgment fell. The outlaw struggled, fury breaking into 1,000 useless motions, and cursed them with a vocabulary foul enough to stain the desert wind. But the cowboy held him pinned with a steady weight, voice low and iron when he spoke. He would not be the hand that delivered death in cold blood, not because he lacked the skill, but because killing would make him the same kind of ruin the scarred man embodied. Instead he would bind him, deliver him where the law might reach him, or failing that, leave him in a place where men who traded in captives could be watched until a proper reckoning arrived. The boy looked up with a mixture of triumph and something fragile that nearly broke the cowboy, the look of a child who had seen the arc of fear bend back into hope. And Naya, hands streaked with dirt and bruises, touched the cowboy's face with a small, tentative gesture that said thank you without words, the kind of gratitude that strips a man bare of pretense. Around them the other raiders, bruised and stunned, were stirring, the firelight catching in their eyes like the last embers of an ugly pride, and the cowboy kept his gaze on the scarred leader, measuring what his presence there would mean if left unchecked. He tied the final knot and pushed himself up, boots sinking into the churned dirt as he regarded the captured man with something like pity edged with contempt. Pity because the villain had been so utterly hollowed by greed that he could not even imagine the worth of a human life beyond coin. Contempt because men like him thrived by convincing others the world was a place where nothing mattered and thus everything could be taken. The cowboy turned then to the siblings, kneeling to check Naya's wounds with hands steady despite their shaking, murmuring practical things, a promise to bring water, a vow to find a patrol or a post where justice might be served. And as he spoke, his voice was stripped of rhetoric and full of an honest, weary resolve that carried more weight than any speech. He could have ended the outlaw with a single final blow, could have let the desert swallow one more guilty soul and called it justice. But as the boy and his sister clung together, eyes wet and bright with a new kind of fierce calm, the cowboy understood that choosing to bind rather than kill was the story he wanted to leave on this land. Not one of vengeance, but a hard, imperfect justice. And so he left the scarred man tied and breathing, a captive now of consequences rather than of blood, and led Naya and her brother away from the firelight toward a horizon that, this time, promised at least the chance of a better morning. Dawn approached like a shy thing, timid at first, brushing pale gold across the edges of the storm clouds that still clung to the sky like tired remnants of a night that had tried its best to break them. And the cowboy walked beside the siblings as they moved slowly across the softening plains, the horse trailing behind them with quiet, heavy footsteps that matched the rhythm of the land, remembering how to breathe. Naya leaned against her brother, their shoulders touching as though neither could fully believe the other was real, and their whispered words, small, halting confessions about fear, about hope, about the strange courage that rises when the world feels about to crack, floated in the cool air like smoke rising from a dying fire, delicate but unmistakably alive. The cowboy kept a steady pace, his body aching from the fight, ribs bruised from where the scarred man had nearly crushed him, knuckles raw from vengeance resisted and justice chosen instead. Yet within him something unexpected flickered, something he had not felt in years, something dangerously close to warmth, maybe even hope, though he would never name it aloud. He had long ago stopped counting the times the frontier had taught him how easily life could be taken, how quickly innocence could be stolen, how rarely mercy took root in soil packed with blood. But watching the siblings cling to one another in the softening dawn made him feel, for the first time in a long while, that the fight he had given himself to might have carved back a small piece of the world from the hands of cruelty. Naya stumbled once, her legs still stiff and bruised from being bound, and the boy caught her with hands trembling not from fear but from the instinct to protect, murmuring her name with a tenderness that made the cowboy glance away, giving them the privacy of their relief. She whispered something back, voice hoarse, perhaps apologizing for being taken or insisting it was not her fault, and the boy pressed his forehead to hers, a gesture so full of forgiveness and fierce devotion that the cowboy felt it echo in his own chest like a small, steady drum signaling that some pieces of humanity were too resilient to be silenced. The landscape around them brightened slowly, in layers, the storm clouds curling away to reveal shy glimpses of blue, the plains drinking in the new light until the grass glimmered with silver dew, the distant ridges stretching into their full shapes as though waking from a troubled dream. And with every step forward, the weight on the cowboy's shoulders shifted, not gone but eased, replaced by a quiet understanding that surviving the night meant more than escaping death. It meant stepping back toward life with a willingness to face what would come next, to answer for the choices made, to accept the changes carved into one's own spirit. After a while the boy, who had been whispering with Naya in a soft rhythm of shared breath and memory, slowed his steps until he was beside the cowboy, his small hand brushing against the man's coat as if searching for courage or certainty or simply connection. And after a moment he looked up, eyes wide but no longer hollow, and asked the question that had clearly been building in him from the moment the cowboy appeared out of the mesquite shadows. Why did you help us? The cowboy stopped walking, the morning wind brushing lightly against his face as if urging him to answer with more than habit or deflection. But the truth caught in his throat because he had no grand reason, no noble speech prepared, only the simple knowledge that had driven him from the first moment the boy had stumbled before him, pleading for help with the kind of raw desperation that strips the man down to his bare moral bones. He sighed, rubbing a thumb along the frayed edge of his glove, searching for words that wouldn't break under their own weight, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low but steady, carrying the honesty of a man who no longer feared the truth inside him. "Because someone had to," he said, the words floating in the warming air like a small offering, neither boast nor apology, just the quiet fact of a choice made when the world demanded it. The boy absorbed the answer with a slow nod, as if tucking it into a place where courage and gratitude lived side by side, and Naya, limping slightly but walking with a fierce steadiness, looked back at the cowboy with eyes that held both thanks and understanding, offering a small nod of her own. And as the rising sun painted the plains in shades of gold and rose, casting away the last shadows of the storm, the three of them continued forward, not toward glory, not toward certainty, but toward the fragile, stubborn brightness of a new day that they had earned together. They rode toward the cavalry post like reluctant confessions, the scarred man trusting silent between two soldiers who smelled of coffee and authority. And the road felt different now, less a place of endless choice and more a ledger where actions had been entered and could not be erased. The cowboy walked the line beside the patrol, boots whispering on the warm dust, feeling the weight of what he had done settle into his bones not as relief but as a still, durable thing that would not let him pretend nothing had changed. The post itself squatted like a patient sentinel on a low rise, its flag whipping in a breeze that carried the strange, clean smell of discipline and the low murmur of men who had been assigned order. The commanding sergeant met them at the gate with a mixture of suspicion and professional courtesy, eyes moving over the bound outlaw, the boy, and the girl until something shifted in his face, something the cowboy recognized as the complicated arithmetic of duty when it met human consequence. There were questions, of course, names to be given, dates, distances, but the cowboy kept his answers spare, giving what was needed and no more, because he had seen how stories could be chewed into different shapes by those who needed simple narratives for complicated sins. He wanted instead to leave them with the raw or truth. A girl had been stolen and returned, a man who trafficked in people had been caught, and some measure of responsibility now rested with those who represented the law. The sergeant examined the scarred leader with a professional cool that made the outlaw bristle. There was talk of transport to a larger fort, of paperwork that might lead to a trial, and promises of inquiry that smelt faintly of bureaucracy and hope in equal measure. The cowboy watched the exchange with an evenness that came from long practice in keeping private storms contained. Yet beneath his outward calm lay the small, persistent worry that the machinery of justice sometimes ground slowly enough for cruelty to seek loopholes, still, binding the man's hands and delivering him into an institution that at least had a record was a moral line drawn in daylight rather than in a shallow grave. And for now that had to be enough. The boy and Naya lingered at the edge of the yard, reunited yet small in the shadow of the formalities, and when the sergeant turned his back to confer with a subordinate, the siblings approached the cowboy in a way that was both tentative and complete, like people closing a wound with a careful, grateful touch. They did not offer gold or grand speeches. Naya simply took his hand, palest and rough from a life on the trail, and pressed it to her forehead in a gesture of thanks that had no need for words, while the boy looked up and said, in a voice still raw but steady, "You brought us home." The simplicity of it hit the cowboy harder than the scarred man's taunts had, and for a moment his throat tightened, because the currency he had spent to earn their safety was memory and risk and the raw moral muscle of choosing to stand between harm and innocence, and that price could not be accounted for in coin or accommodation. The sergeant offered them food and a measure of shelter until they could be escorted back to their people, and the cowboy accepted only a cup of water, refusing the idea of staying where formal thanks might turn to parade or spectacle. He had never been comfortable with crowds that applauded what they did not understand, preferring instead the quiet correctness of a thing well done. As the siblings prepared to leave under the watchful eyes of a soldier assigned to escort them, Naya turned once more, gripping the cowboy's hand again, and said something small, an honest wish for him to keep living in ways that would let him sleep, and the boy, cheeks still smudged with the night's grime, added a crooked, earnest promise that when they could, they would tell their people his name and what he had done. Words like that settle into a man differently than metals. They live inside the soft places, reshaping the contours of loneliness into something bearable. When they finally rode away, the cowboy watched them go until their figures melted into the distance and the land folded them into a small silhouette against the morning, their steps toward home small and urgent and perfectly ordinary. And he felt a quiet, complicated warmth, relief braided with sorrow, hope tempered by the knowledge that the frontier would offer no guarantees. He stayed a moment longer at the post's edge, feeling the weight of the bound outlaw as if it had imprinted on the air behind him, then swung up onto his horse and turned his face toward the horizon. Alone again, he rode into a wide openness that would not moralize his choice for him but would hold it as a fact he would carry, the simple truth settling in like dust. Sometimes the smallest voices demand the greatest courage. As he slid into motion, the plains stretched out, patient and indifferent, and the cowboy felt his decision hum in his chest, a quiet engine that would keep him moving toward whatever ended or began beyond the line where earth met sky. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.